When we picture the Middle Ages, we imagine knights, castles, and honor. But beneath that romantic surface lay a harsher truth. Prostitution was everywhere. It was tolerated, regulated, and punished, a shadow industry woven into daily life. If you enjoy this kind of story, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Now, make yourself comfortable and let us step straight into the streets and brothels of medieval towns, where reality was far stranger and far more unsettling than legend would have us believe. Picture yourself entering a medieval city in the 14th century. The walls rise high above you, stone towers casting long shadows across muddy roads. At the gates, merchants unload carts, guards inspect goods, and peasants shuffle through with baskets of grain. And there, just beyond the gate, you notice a cluster of houses with lanterns hung over the doors. Outside, women linger, some in yellow scarves, others with striped veils or red shoes that gleam against the dirt. Everyone knows what these colors mean. They are prostitutes, marked not in secret, but in public view, walking emblems of sin, tolerated by the very society that despises them. This is the first shock for us today. Prostitution was not hidden in the Middle Ages. It stood in plain sight, woven openly into the fabric of urban life. And perhaps more surprising still, it was the church itself that defended this arrangement. Priests thundered against lust from the pulpit, warning that fornication led to damnation. Yet, in the same breath, theologians admitted that prostitutes were necessary evils. The roots of this strange tolerance lay in the writings of St. Augustine. He famously argued that prostitution was like the sewers of a city, dirty, unpleasant, but indispensable. Remove the sewers, he warned, and filth would overflow into the streets. Remove prostitutes, and lust would overflow into respectable households. Centuries later, Thomas Aquinas echoed the same reasoning. Lust, he said, was a dangerous passion, but it was better for men to sin with prostitutes than to risk the corruption of virgins or the dishonor of wives. It is a startling paradox, a church that condemned sin as deadly, yet built entire moral arguments around keeping sin contained. Prostitutes were cast as scapegoats, enduring shame so that others might remain untouched. Their very existence was framed as service, unholy, yet socially useful. This uneasy acceptance shaped the laws of towns across Europe. Civic authorities worked hand in hand with clerics to carve out spaces for prostitution. In Paris, prostitutes were confined to certain streets near the river. In Avignon, they clustered around districts maintained with papal oversight. In Nuremberg, women wore red sleeves so they could be recognized instantly in public. The message was clear. You may exist, but you will exist only as marked outsiders. For the women, this meant life under constant surveillance. They were forbidden from approaching churches, schools, or marketplaces. To cross those boundaries was to invite punishment, fines, whippings, or expulsion, and yet, paradoxically, their taxes were welcome. Coins collected from prostitutes funded roads, bridges, and sometimes even the churches whose bells rang above their quarters. Sin and sanctity were tangled together, and everyone knew it. Religious rhetoric deepened the stigma. Priests preached that prostitutes bore the punishment of Eve, condemned to suffer for the weakness of men. They were compared to wild animals, dangerous but useful when contained. Yet those same sermons admitted again and again that without prostitutes, greater chaos would follow. The contradiction was never resolved. It was simply repeated, like a drumbeat across the centuries. The hypocrisy extended into daily life. Men who visited prostitutes slipped away unmarked, their reputations intact. The women, meanwhile, carried shame like a cloak they could never remove. They were mocked in parades, forced to wear humiliating clothing, and excluded from civic life. Yet they endured, because survival left them no choice. What makes this contradiction even more striking is its visibility. Unlike modern societies where prostitution often hides in shadows, medieval towns placed it openly at their edges. Everyone knew where the brothels were. Everyone knew the colors of shame. Prostitutes were both despised and indispensable, tolerated not out of compassion but out of fear, fear that without them, society would unravel. In the end, prostitution in the Middle Ages was less about desire than about control. The church, while preaching salvation, quietly administered sin. Civic leaders, while boasting of order, profited from vice. And prostitutes themselves lived at the center of this paradox. Visible, yet excluded. Tolerated, yet despised. Condemned as sinners while being defended as necessary. Their presence, marked by clothing and confined by law, was a constant reminder of the hypocrisy at the heart of medieval morality. To walk past them was to glimpse the uneasy compromise that defined the age, a society that thundered against sin, even as it built its walls, its bridges, and sometimes its very churches upon the coins of the condemned. Step deeper into a medieval town, and you will soon find the most paradoxical of institutions, the official brothel. These were not secret dens hidden away in alleys, but legal establishments, sanctioned by city councils and sometimes even by bishops. To modern eyes, it seems unthinkable. Yet in the Middle Ages, brothels stood as civic monuments to hypocrisy, places where sin was organized, taxed, and quietly celebrated for the revenue it brought. A medieval brothel was often called a public house of women. The name carried no disguise. Everyone knew its purpose. In many towns, such houses stood deliberately on the edges, by the gates, near rivers, or along bridges, where merchants and travelers could find them easily. A newcomer entering Avignon, for example, would pass taverns and houses marked with lanterns or carvings, each signaling the trade within. Location was no accident. Authorities wanted brothels accessible enough for clients, but far enough from churches and markets to preserve the illusion of purity. Inside, the reality was far from the romantic images that later centuries would invent. These were not chambers of velvet and music, but crude halls partitioned into narrow cells. Straw bedding, wooden benches, and smoky oil lamps defined the atmosphere. The air reeked of ale, sweat, and unwashed bodies. Noise from taverns often bled into the rooms, shouting, singing, and drunken laughter. For the women, it was a world of endless repetition, one client after another, night after night, with little rest or privacy. Yet these houses were treated like any other business. They were managed by appointed figures, sometimes women known as procuresses, other times men called pandars, who acted as intermediaries between prostitutes and authorities. Their job was to enforce rules, collect payments, and ensure taxes reached the city coffers. A good manager was less concerned with compassion than with order and revenue. If a woman fell ill or broke regulations, she could be expelled without hesitation. The profits were staggering. In Avignon during the 14th century, taxes from brothels were recorded in municipal budgets alongside market tolls and bridge repairs. In certain German towns, officials auctioned the right to run brothels, ensuring steady income for city treasuries. The irony is almost theatrical. Sermons thundered against lust, while the very coins of prostitutes helped fund the chapels where those sermons were delivered. It was sin turned into stone, shame converted into infrastructure. One striking example comes from Toulouse, where revenues from prostitution were used to maintain bridges. Travelers walking across solid arches of stone, thanking God for their safety, might never suspect that their crossing was funded by women paraded as sinners in the streets. And yet, this was the quiet reality of medieval economics. Vice was not just tolerated, it was essential. Rules inside brothels were rigid. Women were often required to line up as clients entered, their choices made in silence. Prices were fixed by ordinance, and hours of operation were sometimes dictated by city councils. In certain towns, brothels even closed on feast days, as though holiness could be preserved by pausing vice temporarily. The illusion of control mattered more than reality. Despite the rigid structure, illegal prostitution thrived. Women outside official brothels worked in taverns, homes, and alleys, often at lower prices. City leaders railed against this competition, not out of moral outrage, but because it cut into their revenue. Prosecutions targeted women who operated independently, branding them as disorderly, while brothels under license carried on under official protection. The hypocrisy was obvious. It was not prostitution itself that was condemned, but prostitution that failed to pay. The brothel thus became a symbol of medieval pragmatism, a building where lust was confined, shame was displayed, and profit was extracted. It stood as both a warning and a convenience, a paradox made of stone and straw. To the authorities, it was proof that sin could be managed. To the church, it was a concession to human weakness. To the women, it was a cage, inescapable, humiliating, and yet, for many, the only path to survival. In the end, the official brothel was more than a place of transaction. It was a monument to contradiction, where sin paid for sanctity, where women were reduced to numbers in a ledger, and where entire communities colluded in the quiet lie that vice could be contained by walls. To exist as a prostitute in the Middle Ages was to live under a system of constant branding, rules that marked you not just in your trade, but in every step of your daily life. You could not walk to market, fetch water, or light a candle in your window without the law's shadow falling across you. The regulations were relentless, not because society wanted fairness, but because it wanted control. The first rule was visibility. Medieval authorities feared nothing more than blurred boundaries. A respectable woman and a prostitute could not look alike, lest the illusion of order collapse. Cities imposed strict dress codes to ensure that prostitutes were recognizable at a glance. In Paris, they wore striped hoods. In Venice, yellow scarves. In Nuremberg, red shoes or sleeves. These garments were not fashion. They were marks of shame, as visible as brands on the skin. A prostitute entering a marketplace carried her condemnation on her body, subjected to whispers, jeers, or mocking laughter. Respectable women clutched their children closer. Men smirked, knowing her place. The clothes reduced her to a symbol, erasing any chance of anonymity. The second rule was confinement. Prostitutes were restricted to certain districts, often near rivers, gates, or the shadowed corners of towns. To be seen outside these boundaries was a punishable offense. In Avignon, prostitutes who approached churches could be fined or whipped. In London, they were confined to Southwark, across the Thames, away from the city's core. Their world shrank to narrow alleys and crowded taverns, as though invisible walls kept them trapped. Even when not working, they were expected to remain in their quarter, watched by neighbors, guards, and officials. Taxes compounded the burden. Every transaction, every movement, every piece of clothing was another opportunity for officials to extract revenue. Women paid for licenses, for the right to stand in designated places, for the privilege of wearing their required clothing. In some cities, even their meals were taxed. Municipal records in Avignon and Toulouse show prostitution listed alongside grain, wine, and market stalls, as if women themselves were just another commodity to be measured. The cruelty was that while the women's money was welcomed, their humanity was denied. Punishments for disobedience were harsh. A woman who left her district might be paraded through the streets, her clothing torn or reversed to emphasize disgrace. In German towns, prostitutes caught without their mandated garments had their heads shaved in public, stripping away one of the deepest symbols of feminine honor. Whipping posts stood as constant threats, where women could be tied and lashed for minor infractions. The punishments were theatrical, designed less to correct than to display. Each humiliation reminded the community of the boundary between purity and vice. And yet, these regulations did not apply equally. Men who visited prostitutes faced no distinctive clothing, no districts, no taxes. They walked freely in and out of brothels, their reputations protected by silence. The double standard was glaring. Women bore the shame, men bore none. The law treated prostitutes not as citizens with rights, but as vessels of sin to be controlled, displayed, and discarded. Despite the cruelty, some women managed to adapt. They paid their dues, wore their marks, and endured the surveillance, hoping to avoid harsher punishments. Compliance meant survival. But survival came at the cost of dignity, as every aspect of their lives was reduced to regulations that reinforced their exclusion. The obsession with marking and controlling prostitutes reveals the medieval mind at its most paradoxical. Prostitution was tolerated, even relied upon, but it had to be made visible, branded, and contained. The clothing, the districts, the taxes, and the punishments all served one purpose: to transform women into symbols of sin, reminders of what was tolerated only because it was controlled. To walk through a medieval town was to see this paradox everywhere. Prostitutes moving through streets in their marked clothing, visible yet excluded, paying into a system that despised them, their very existence a warning to others. They were not simply women, they were instruments of order, their bodies turned into living signposts of morality. In the end, these rules reveal the core truth of medieval prostitution. It was never about compassion, and rarely even about lust. It was about control. The women were allowed to exist only because they carried society's contradictions on their shoulders, branded and humiliated so that others could walk in the illusion of purity. To understand prostitution in the Middle Ages, one must look closely at the women themselves, not as a faceless mass, but as individuals drawn into the trade by circumstance, poverty, or force. Their profiles were diverse, yet they shared one tragic reality. They lived outside the protection of society, branded as both necessary and despised. Contrary to romanticized notions, most prostitutes were not exotic courtesans draped in silk, entertaining kings in lavish chambers. Those figures existed, of course, but they were the rare exceptions, celebrated in poetry and rumor. The majority were poor, desperate women who had slipped through the cracks of medieval life. Widows, orphans, abandoned wives, and unmarried girls without dowries were especially vulnerable. Without male protection or property, survival was nearly impossible. Work was scarce for women. Domestic service, spinning, and selling food in markets provided meager wages. For some, prostitution became the last option to avoid starvation. Records from towns across Europe show how often poverty pushed women into this role. In Nuremberg, officials noted that many prostitutes were women without bread, lacking families or support. In Florence, tax rolls reveal that widows who could not afford to remarry frequently ended up in brothels. In Paris, young girls who came to the city in search of work sometimes fell into the trade when promises of employment collapsed into exploitation. Their stories followed a pattern: isolation, hunger, and the absence of choices. Another common profile was the runaway servant. Domestic service was one of the few forms of employment available to young women, but it was rife with abuse. Servants were often subject to the desires of their masters, dismissed when rumors spread, and left without references. Many drifted into prostitution after losing their positions, carrying with them the stigma of being fallen. In some cases, former servants were accused of theft or misconduct, and prostitution became the only livelihood left open to them. There were also women who were sold or coerced into brothels. Families under crushing debt sometimes offered daughters to pimps or managers in exchange for money. Orphans without guardians were sometimes placed directly into municipal brothels, their wages treated as a contribution to the community. These cases highlight how little agency many women had over their own bodies and futures. In a society where women were often treated as property, their passage into prostitution could be as transactional as the trade itself. Not all prostitutes were entirely destitute. Some entered the trade with a degree of calculation, seeking a way to earn more than spinning or washing could provide. For them, prostitution promised temporary independence, a chance to control their earnings and escape dependence on fathers or husbands. But this independence was fragile and came at the price of social disgrace. Even women who voluntarily entered the trade found themselves trapped, unable to leave once branded with the stigma. Age also played a role in defining profiles. Many prostitutes were very young, sometimes only in their teens. They were in demand for their perceived purity, yet their youth also reflected the desperation of their families or guardians. Older women often remained in the trade because no other path was open to them, though they were considered less desirable and sometimes forced to accept lower wages or harsher clients. Life expectancy within the trade was short, not only because of disease but because of violence and the physical toll of the work. Despite these grim realities, communities often spoke of prostitutes as if they were a single, indistinguishable group. They were the women of the street, stripped of personal histories. Yet when glimpses of individual stories emerge in court records or chronicles, they reveal human beings caught in impossible circumstances. One woman in 15th century Cologne was recorded as saying she turned to prostitution only after being abandoned by her husband and denied help from her parish. Another, in London, testified that she had fled an abusive household and found no other way to survive. These voices, rare but haunting, remind us that behind the rules and taxes were lives full of suffering and resilience. The social origins of prostitutes expose the harshness of medieval society. A system that valued women primarily as daughters, wives, and mothers offered little room for survival outside those roles. A girl without a dowry, a widow without property, or a servant cast out in disgrace all faced the same grim prospect. In that sense, prostitution was less a choice than a sentence, imposed by poverty, abandonment, and inequality. To the rulers and clergy, these women were statistics, revenue, or moral warnings. To themselves, they were simply trying to live another day. Their backgrounds varied, but the outcome was the same. They were pushed to the margins, tolerated only in shame, and remembered less as individuals than as symbols of society's contradictions. To step into the life of a medieval prostitute is to enter a world of constant uncertainty, danger, and exhaustion. Far from the romantic vision spun by later writers, daily life was marked by monotony, vulnerability, and a steady erosion of dignity. The first reality was physical space. Most women lived in cramped quarters, either within official brothels or in rented rooms in marginal districts. Privacy was nearly non-existent. In a city-sanctioned brothel, several women shared narrow cells divided by wooden partitions. Straw bedding was common, replaced only when it became too foul. Light came from smoky oil lamps or candles, and the air was thick with the smell of ale, sweat, and unwashed bodies. The constant press of people, clients, managers, other women, meant that solitude was rare. For those who lived in unofficial spaces, conditions were even worse. Damp cellars, drafty attics, or unstable shacks hastily built near town walls. The rhythm of the day was mechanical. In many brothels, women were expected to line up in the evenings as clients arrived. Prices were often fixed by regulation or the manager, leaving the women little say in negotiation. Some cities even dictated opening hours, as though prostitution were a trade like baking or blacksmithing. Sundays and holy days were officially reserved for worship, but rules were often ignored, with women summoned by clients even as church bells rang. Fatigue was constant, as the pressure to earn never relented. Danger was everywhere. Violence from clients was a daily risk. Although managers sometimes intervened, women were largely unprotected. A man who refused to pay, or who grew aggressive, could strike or injure them with little consequence. Complaints were rare, for courts seldom took their word against that of a respectable male. In some towns, prostitutes were required to sign agreements accepting responsibility for whatever might happen during encounters, legal documents that absolved clients of guilt. Such contracts exposed the stark imbalance of power. The woman's body was the product, and damage to it was considered part of the trade. Disease was another ever-present threat. The late Middle Ages saw the spread of venereal infections, long before effective treatments existed. Women often relied on herbal remedies, poultices, or prayers to combat symptoms, but these provided little relief. Medical authorities, when they paid attention at all, tended to treat prostitutes as vectors of disease rather than patients. The irony was brutal. Society used these women as a safety valve for male desire, then blamed them when illness spread. Shame and humiliation also structured daily life. Distinctive clothing marked prostitutes in public, ensuring they could not blend into crowds. A woman walking to the market in her striped hood or yellow veil carried the weight of scorn on her shoulders. Children jeered, men sneered, and women of respectable status avoided them altogether. The clothing, meant as a symbol of control, became a permanent scar, stripping them of anonymity and subjecting them to ridicule. Economic survival added to the strain. Although prostitution was profitable for city treasuries and brothel managers, the women themselves earned little. A large share of their wages went to rent, taxes, and daily necessities. Many remained trapped in debt, unable to save enough to escape. Stories survive of women who worked for years in brothels, only to end up penniless when age reduced their desirability. For them, there was no retirement, only a slow descent into poverty. Outside threats compounded their misery. Robbery was common in districts associated with prostitution. Thieves targeted women as easy victims, knowing they carried coins late at night and had little recourse to justice. Some prostitutes attempted to form protective groups, sharing rooms or pooling money for safety, but solidarity was fragile in a trade designed to isolate and stigmatize. The psychological toll was immense. Contemporary accounts describe women who laughed and sang in taverns by night, only to weep in their beds once the doors were closed. Chroniclers noted the bitterness that grew with time as years of shame and violence eroded hope. The church offered no refuge. Priests might pity them, but rarely welcomed them. Confession was possible, but absolution often required abandoning the trade entirely, an option many could not afford. Children born into this environment faced their own hardships. Some were abandoned at church steps or given to foundling homes. Others grew up within brothels, learning early that society marked them as outcasts. A girl raised in such conditions risked repeating her mother's fate, trapped in a cycle of marginalization. In short, the daily life of a medieval prostitute was a life on the edge, physically cramped, economically fragile, socially despised, and constantly threatened. These women existed in the shadows of society, tolerated but never accepted, their survival measured day by day. Each sunrise brought the same struggles: where to find safety, how to endure clients, and how to avoid the punishments of a world that used them but never forgave them. If daily life for medieval prostitutes was already marked by danger and humiliation, the presence of disease added another unbearable layer. In an age before antibiotics, infections spread swiftly, and the very trade that sustained these women also condemned them to suffer in silence. The combination of illness, ineffective medicine, and relentless stigma made their existence all the more fragile. The most common afflictions were venereal diseases, though medieval people did not understand them as we do today. Syphilis, for example, did not become widespread in Europe until the late 15th century, but other infections, gonorrhea, chancroid, and a host of unnamed inflammations, were well known. Contemporary doctors often lumped these conditions together under vague terms like the burning sickness or the shameful disease. Their symptoms were described in medical texts: sores, discharges, fevers, and a gradual wasting of the body. Treatment was primitive and often painful. Physicians prescribed ointments made of mercury, sulfur, or vinegar rubbed onto the affected areas. Herbal remedies included mixtures of sage, rosemary, and garlic meant to purify the blood. In more extreme cases, doctors resorted to cauterization, burning lesions with hot irons, or bleeding under the belief that excess humors were the cause. These treatments rarely cured. At best, they eased symptoms temporarily, while often worsening the suffering. Prostitutes, lacking money to pay learned doctors, were more likely to rely on midwives, herbalists, or home remedies whispered among themselves. Illness was not only physical, but also social. Once a woman showed visible symptoms, her fate darkened quickly. Some brothels expelled sick women, claiming to protect clients and the reputation of the house. Others forced them to continue working until they collapsed. In certain towns, authorities rounded up diseased prostitutes and confined them to special hospitals or leper houses. The distinction between venereal disease and leprosy blurred in the medieval imagination. Both marked the body with shame, and both were seen as punishments from God. Religious interpretation deepened the stigma. Priests preached that sickness among prostitutes was divine justice, a visible sign of sin manifested on the flesh. Sermons described diseased women as warnings, their sores proof that lust led inevitably to decay. Such preaching stripped them of compassion, turning them into living symbols of corruption. Instead of patience, they became parables, reminders for the faithful to remain pure. The stigma spread beyond the women themselves. Children born from prostitution, especially if visibly sickly, were branded from birth as cursed. Midwives sometimes refused to assist in their deliveries, fearing contagion or moral taint. Communities whispered about whore-s children, as if the sins of the mother passed directly into the blood of the child. Even in cases where disease was not present, the suspicion lingered, shaping lives long after birth. Despite the cruelty, there were glimpses of humanity. In some cities, charitable confraternities funded hospitals for the poor, and prostitutes occasionally found refuge there. Nuns in certain orders provided care, though always with the condition of repentance. These acts of mercy were rare, but they stand as faint reminders that not all hearts were hardened. Yet for the majority, stigma overshadowed compassion. One telling example comes from 15th century Strasbourg, where authorities ordered that diseased prostitutes be paraded through the streets before being expelled. Their swollen bodies, covered in rags, were displayed like living warnings. Crowds gathered to jeer, throwing stones or filth. The spectacle was less about health and more about moral theater, reinforcing the line between the clean and the unclean. In this way, disease became not just a private affliction, but a public punishment. The fear of contagion also fueled wider suspicion. In times of plague or epidemic, prostitutes were often blamed as carriers. Rumors claimed they spread sickness deliberately, or that their immorality invited God's wrath on entire towns. These accusations reflected the deep association between sexuality and danger in the medieval mind. To sleep with a prostitute was to risk not only one's soul, but one's body, a truth men recognized yet ignored, returning again and again to the very women they condemned. For the women themselves, disease stripped away even the little security they had. A healthy prostitute might at least pay her taxes and survive within the system. A sick one became disposable, a burden to be cast out. Their bodies, once exploited for profit, were abandoned once they ceased to serve. Death often came early, in pain and obscurity, with no prayers or memorials. Many were buried in unconsecrated ground, denied even the dignity of rest among the community. In the end, disease among prostitutes in the Middle Ages was not merely a medical problem, it was a moral judgment, a social weapon, and a source of humiliation. It exposed the hypocrisy of a system that tolerated vice for profit but abandoned the very women who sustained it. The scars on their bodies told a story not only of infection but of a society eager to condemn while refusing to protect. Their suffering, magnified by stigma, became part of the medieval landscape, a silent, ever-present reminder that the wages of sin were paid not in gold, but in flesh. If prostitutes lived on the margins of medieval society, their clients came from nearly every corner of it. The system survived not because of the women alone, but because there was a steady and constant demand. To understand prostitution in the Middle Ages, one must also ask, who were the men who sought their services, and why did they go? The stereotype painted by preachers was simple: young bachelors, filled with unruly desires, unable to control themselves without the safety valve of prostitution. This image was not entirely false. Many clients were unmarried men, particularly apprentices, servants, or soldiers passing through towns. For them, marriage was delayed by years of work, savings, or waiting for guild membership. In the meantime, brothels offered an outlet sanctioned in a strange way by the authorities themselves. City leaders often justified prostitution on this very basis. Better to allow young men access to prostitutes than risk seductions of honest women. But the reality extended far beyond bachelors. Married men were also frequent visitors. Despite the church's insistence on fidelity, records and moral complaints suggest that husbands often turned to prostitutes while their wives remained at home. Some justified this behavior by claiming it preserved the sanctity of the marriage bed. Others simply sought variety or escape from domestic obligations. For these men, the double standard was glaring. Their own lapses were tolerated, while women caught in adultery faced punishment, humiliation, or death. Clerics, too, appear in records as clients. The presence of priests and monks in brothels was a constant scandal in medieval towns. Chronicles mention scandals where entire groups of clerics were caught in houses of prostitution. In some regions, authorities issued decrees specifically forbidding priests from entering brothels, rules that had to be repeated again and again, suggesting how often they were ignored. The contradiction was obvious. Men who preached chastity on Sunday night could be found in the red light district by Monday evening. Nobles and wealthy merchants also sought prostitutes, though in different circumstances. They often bypassed public brothels, preferring private arrangements. A rich man might keep a mistress disguised as a servant, or pay discreet visits to women outside the official districts. For them, Prostitution was less about survival and more about luxury. They could afford cleaner rooms, finer clothes for their partners, and more secrecy. Yet even their wealth could not erase the stigma. When exposed, noblemen sometimes faced scorn, though rarely real punishment. The anonymity of prostitution appealed to many clients. In the crowded spaces of medieval towns, where reputations mattered and gossip spread quickly, the brothel offered a place where desires could be indulged without names exchanged. The women wore their distinctive clothing openly, but the men slipped in and out unmarked, their identities protected by silence. This imbalance shaped the entire system. Shame belonged to the women, freedom to the men. Motivations varied. For some, it was simple lust. For others, it was curiosity, a desire to experience what was forbidden. Young men, teased by friends or pressured by peers, sometimes visited brothels as a kind of initiation into adulthood. Soldiers returning from campaigns often celebrated in taverns and brothels, their wages quickly spent in a haze of drink and desire. Merchants traveling from town to town treated brothels as predictable stops, as much a part of the journey as inns and marketplaces. Yet there was also a darker side to client behavior. Some men sought not only sex, but domination. Violence and humiliation were common, tolerated by a system that saw the women as disposable. Court records contain chilling accounts of women beaten, mutilated, or even killed by clients whose anger or cruelty went unchecked. These cases rarely led to punishment. More often, the women were blamed for provoking the attack, or the death was quietly ignored. The range of clients, poor and rich, young and old, laymen and clerics, shows how deeply prostitution was woven into medieval society. It was not a fringe activity, but a practice sustained by men from all walks of life. The hypocrisy was stark. The same rulers who taxed brothels visited them. The same priests who condemned lust indulged in it. The same husbands who demanded fidelity sought pleasure elsewhere. In the end, the clients were not just participants. They were the true engine of the system. Without their steady demand, the trade would not have thrived. And yet, while women bore the brunt of shame and regulation, men walked away with their reputations intact. This imbalance reveals more than just medieval sexuality. It exposes the gendered double standards that shaped the entire society. Prostitution was tolerated not for the sake of the women who endured it, but for the comfort and convenience of the men who sustained it. No subject revealed the contradictions of medieval society more clearly than prostitution. While clients came from every rank, the official reactions of the church and civic authorities oscillated between moral outrage and cold pragmatism. They thundered against sin in sermons and edicts, yet quietly managed, taxed, and sometimes even defended the trade. The church's voice was the loudest, and its words carried weight. Preachers described prostitution as a plague upon the soul, a visible wound upon the body of Christendom. Lust, they warned, dragged men into damnation and women into disgrace. Tales of biblical sinners, Rahab, Mary Magdalene, the women caught in adultery, were retold again and again as cautionary examples. Prostitutes, in this rhetoric, symbolized the corruption of the flesh, the danger of Eve, the ever-present temptation that threatened male virtue. And yet, for all this thunder, the church never demanded complete eradication of prostitution. Theologians like Thomas Aquinas echoed the logic of Augustine centuries before him. Remove prostitutes and society would fall into worse sins. Brothels, they argued, were lesser evils, containers for lust that prevented greater disorder. It was better to confine male desire to known quarters than risk seductions that might disrupt families or corrupt virgins. Thus, even while calling prostitutes sinners, the church tolerated their presence. Authorities at the civic level followed this reasoning with practical enthusiasm. Town councils, magistrates, and lords realized that brothels could be profitable. Taxes filled their coffers and regulations gave them control. Many cities officially sanctioned brothels, assigning managers and issuing licenses, while at the same time parading prostitutes through the streets in rituals of humiliation. They balanced morality with money, always ready to condemn, yet unwilling to lose revenue. The contradiction appeared even in law. Civic statutes often contained clauses that sounded severe, threatening prostitutes with expulsion, fines, or beatings. Yet in practice, these laws were applied selectively. Women who paid their dues and stayed within their districts were left alone. The real wrath of the law was reserved for those who stepped outside the boundaries, soliciting near churches, refusing to wear distinctive clothing, or working without licenses. The authorities were less concerned with immorality itself than with disorder and disobedience. Public rituals reinforced this dual stance. On certain feast days, prostitutes were forced to join processions wearing humiliating garments, paraded as examples of sin. At the same time, the same towns collected their taxes without shame. In some places, women were even required to pay special levies to fund the very festivals where they were mocked. The hypocrisy was not hidden. It was institutionalized, woven into the rhythm of civic life. The church, too, performed acts of theater. Priests denounced prostitution from pulpits, their voices echoing under vaulted ceilings, while quietly confessing and absolving clients who sought forgiveness. Some parishes even tolerated brothels in their neighborhoods, so long as rents and taxes were paid. A priest might thunder against lust on Sunday and walk past a brothel on Monday, knowing it paid for repairs to the very church he served. There were, however, moments of reform. From time to time, bishops or rulers launched campaigns to close brothels, expel prostitutes, or impose stricter laws. These efforts often coincided with epidemics, wars, or moral panics. Yet such reforms rarely lasted. Within months or years, the trade reappeared, sometimes in the same streets, sometimes under new names. The demand was too constant and the revenue too useful for eradication to succeed. What emerges from these contradictions is a portrait of medieval hypocrisy. The church denounced sin while tolerating it. Authorities punished women for breaking rules they themselves had created. Communities mocked prostitutes as outcasts while depending on them to protect other women's honor and to fund civic projects. The entire system rested on a delicate balance: condemn lust loudly enough to preserve appearances, but quietly manage it to keep society stable. In this way, prostitution became less a question of morality than of control. By branding women, taxing their labor, and confining them to districts, the church and authorities maintained order. The real sin, in their eyes, was not the act itself, but the breach of rules. As long as prostitutes stayed in their place, their existence was tolerated. The moment they crossed invisible boundaries, punishment fell swiftly. The reactions of church and authorities reveal not only the contradictions of the Middle Ages, but also its priorities. Honor, property, and stability outweighed compassion or justice. Prostitutes bore the full weight of moral rhetoric, yet the system itself ensured they would always remain. In the end, the church and rulers did not seek to save these women, but to use them, tools of policy, symbols of sin, and sources of revenue, tolerated in words of fire and deeds of calculation. If one theme runs like a thread through the history of medieval prostitution, it is hypocrisy. Society depended on prostitution, profited from it, and even structured cities around it, yet publicly condemned it with relentless energy. The result was a world where double morality governed every interaction, leaving women crushed beneath the weight of contradictions. The clearest example of this hypocrisy was the treatment of men and women. A prostitute could not walk through the marketplace without her clothing branding her as shameful. A client, however, could visit her at night and walk home in the morning unmarked, his reputation untouched. The same men who mocked these women in public shared their beds in private. Husbands who demanded fidelity from their wives treated infidelity with prostitutes as a minor indulgence. Priests who denounced lust from the pulpit were sometimes found in the very districts they condemned. The double standard was glaring, yet it was accepted as natural. This hypocrisy shaped law and punishment. Women bore the burden of regulation, dress codes, taxes, confinement to districts, parades of humiliation. Men faced almost none of these restrictions. Even when scandals erupted, blame fell more heavily on the women than the men. The logic was perverse. Since prostitutes were already branded as sinful, further condemnation seemed easy, while men could claim weakness or temptation and be quickly absolved. The system reinforced itself, ensuring that shame flowed in one direction only. At the heart of this contradiction lay medieval ideas about honor and reputation. A woman's worth was tied to her chastity, while a man's was measured by property, strength, or status. Thus, a man who visited prostitutes risked little, while a woman who sold sex lost everything. Prostitution was tolerated for the sake of protecting respectable women, but the women who provided this service were despised for doing so. They were scapegoats, carrying the weight of male desire so that others could remain pure. The hypocrisy extended to economics. Taxes from prostitution flowed into city treasuries, funding roads, bridges, and sometimes even churches. Yet the women who provided this income were excluded from the very communities they helped sustain. They paid into the system, but were denied its protections. If attacked or robbed, they had little recourse to law. If ill, they were abandoned. Their money was welcomed, but their humanity was rejected. Public rituals amplified this double morality. Cities staged humiliating processions where prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive clothing, paraded as spectacles of sin. Crowds jeered, children mocked, priests intoned moral lessons, yet many of those same spectators likely visited brothels in secret. The rituals functioned as theater, reaffirming the illusion that society was pure and ordered, while the tolerated existence of prostitution revealed the opposite. Literature and art echoed the same contradictions. Prostitutes appeared in morality plays as symbols of vice, dragged on stage to warn the audience of temptation. Yet in popular songs and tavern ballads, they were portrayed with humor or desire, their presence woven into the fabric of daily entertainment. The tension between condemnation and fascination revealed the fascination society could not admit openly. Even women themselves internalized the hypocrisy. Respectable wives sometimes accepted prostitution as a necessary evil, believing it protected them from harassment. Mothers warned daughters to avoid the districts but whispered about men who went there nonetheless. Communities lived with the contradiction because it seemed unavoidable. Better to stigmatize a few than to confront the deeper reality of uncontrolled desire and systemic inequality. At its core, the double morality surrounding prostitution reveals the limits of medieval justice. It was not fairness that guided the system, but expedience. Women were controlled because they were visible and vulnerable. Men were excused because they were powerful and numerous. The gap between rhetoric and reality was vast, yet it was papered over by rituals of condemnation and the illusion of order. The hypocrisy was not subtle. It was openly practiced and widely acknowledged. Everyone knew that prostitutes were necessary. Everyone also knew they were despised. The tension did not need to be resolved, only managed. And so, for centuries, society lived with this uneasy balance, sustained by denial and silence. In the end, medieval prostitution was not just a trade of bodies, it was a mirror held up to society itself. The double morality it revealed showed a world willing to condemn loudly while indulging quietly, to profit openly while punishing harshly, to maintain an illusion of purity by sacrificing the dignity of those who bore the stain. This contradiction was the heart of the system, and it remains one of the most telling legacies of the Middle Ages. If prostitution was tolerated, it was never free from the threat of punishment. The Middle Ages managed vice with one hand while disciplining it with the other. Prostitutes were permitted to exist, but only within carefully drawn boundaries. Step outside those limits, and the weight of legal sanctions fell quickly, often harshly, on the very women whose labor the system depended upon. The most common form of punishment was fines. A woman who violated dress codes, appeared outside her district, or solicited in forbidden areas could be forced to pay fees she could scarcely afford. These fines added to the endless cycle of debt that trapped many prostitutes, ensuring that they remained under the thumb of both managers and city officials. Unlike taxes, which were predictable, fines were sudden blows, designed to remind women of their fragile status. More humiliating were the punishments that targeted appearance. Authorities often ordered women who broke rules to be paraded through the streets in shame. They might be forced to wear outlandish garments, sometimes in reversed colors, or carry symbolic objects marking them as sinners. In certain towns, prostitutes caught soliciting near churches had their hair cut short or their hoods stripped away, leaving them exposed before mocking crowds. These punishments were theater as much as law, staged to reinforce the boundaries of morality in the eyes of the community. Whipping was another common sanction. Records from German towns describe women tied to posts and lashed for refusing to obey regulations. The number of strokes varied, but the pain was only part of the spectacle. The sight of a prostitute whipped in public was intended to frighten others into obedience and to reassure citizens that sin was being contained. The cruelty of these punishments lay not only in the violence itself, but in the ritual of exposure, as the women's bodies were turned into public warnings. In some cases, punishments grew harsher still. Persistent offenders risked banishment, expelled from the city walls with nothing but the clothes they wore. For women with no property or family, exile was nearly a death sentence, forcing them into wandering, begging, or worse. Some towns branded repeat offenders with hot irons, marking their skin permanently as a sign of disgrace. Others confined them to houses of correction, institutions that combined forced labor with moral instruction, though conditions inside were often brutal. The double standard remained obvious. Men who broke rules by visiting prostitutes in forbidden areas were rarely punished. When they were, their fines were lighter, and their reputations remained intact. Prostitutes bore the brunt of discipline because they were visible, vulnerable, and already stigmatized. The law treated them not as citizens with rights, but as dangerous symbols to be controlled. Religious authorities added their own layer of punishment. Prostitutes were sometimes forced to do penance in churches, kneeling in public while priests recited their sins. They might be barred from receiving communion, excommunicated for repeated offenses, or required to fund candles and offerings as acts of contrition. Yet even here, hypocrisy lingered. The same priests who imposed these penalties might rely on brothel taxes to maintain their parishes. Not all punishments were formal. Communities often took justice into their own hands. In moments of moral panic, mobs targeted prostitutes, dragging them from their quarters, destroying their homes, or beating them in the streets. These outbreaks revealed how fragile tolerance was. Official sanction could vanish overnight, replaced by raw hostility. Prostitutes lived constantly aware that acceptance was conditional, and that society might turn against them without warning. What is striking is how often these punishments were less about individual misdeeds and more about maintaining symbolic order. A prostitute fined for wearing the wrong clothing was not punished because her attire harmed anyone, but because it blurred the line between sin and respectability. A woman whipped for leaving her district was not dangerous in herself, but her presence near a church or market threatened the illusion of purity. Legal sanctions served as performances, reminding society of its rules, while sacrificing the dignity of those forced to bear them. In the end, punishment was inseparable from tolerance. The very existence of prostitution required boundaries, and those boundaries were enforced with pain, humiliation, and fear. The women who lived within this system understood the bargain. They could survive only as long as they obeyed. Step outside, and the law would strip them not only of money, but of dignity, reducing them to spectacles of shame. Their bodies were at once a source of profit and a canvas upon which medieval society painted its lessons in morality. If fines and legal punishments kept prostitutes confined within their boundaries, public humiliation served a different purpose. It was spectacle. These rituals of shame were not about justice in the modern sense, but about reinforcing the community's sense of morality. By exposing prostitutes to ridicule, medieval society turned their bodies and reputations into tools of collective discipline. One of the most common forms of humiliation was the forced parade. A woman accused of breaking regulations might be led through the streets, sometimes stripped to her undergarments, sometimes forced to wear ridiculous clothing. Bells were rung to draw attention, and crowds gathered eagerly to watch. The procession turned private sin into public theater, reminding everyone where the lines of morality were drawn. Children jeered, men shouted insults, women looked away or spat. For the accused, there was no escape. Each step was a mark of disgrace that lingered long after the punishment ended. Distinctive clothing added another layer to these humiliations. Prostitutes already had to wear hoods, veils, or colors marking their status. But when punished, these garments could be exaggerated or inverted. In some towns, women were forced to wear men's clothing as a mockery, or to don pauper crowns painted with obscene symbols. These costumes transformed them into grotesque caricatures. objects of laughter and scorn. The clothing carried a message. Their identities were not their own, but props in a morality play staged for the benefit of the community. Shaving or cutting hair was another powerful symbol. In medieval culture, a woman's hair was closely tied to her honor and femininity. To strip it away was to strip her of dignity. Prostitutes caught soliciting near churches or refusing to wear proper attire were sometimes punished by having their heads shaved in public. The act was not only painful, but devastating, a visible reminder that they no longer belonged to the realm of respectable women. Hair would grow back, but the memory of humiliation endured. Some punishments blended ridicule with labor. Women might be forced to carry heavy stones through the streets or sweep public squares while bystanders mocked them. Others were made to stand for hours in marketplaces holding signs declaring their sins. These acts blurred the line between penance and entertainment. The spectacle was meant to cleanse society symbolically, as if the burden of vice could be lifted by watching the guilty suffer. Humiliation often targeted sexuality directly. There are accounts of prostitutes paraded with wooden phalluses or obscene drawings hung around their necks, designed to ridicule their trade. These punishments degraded them not only as sinners but as women, reducing their identities to symbols of lust. The cruelty lay in the public's complicity. Neighbors and acquaintances joined in the laughter, reinforcing the outcast status of women who were otherwise invisible in daily life. The church also staged humiliations within sacred spaces. Prostitutes doing penance were sometimes made to kneel at the doors of churches, barefoot in plain clothing, as parishioners filed past. Priests preached sermons over their bowed heads, turning their repentance into a living lesson for the congregation. These rituals blurred the line between spiritual correction and social control. They reminded worshippers that sin existed nearby, yet could be contained through ritualized shame. What made these humiliations particularly devastating was their permanence. A fine might be forgotten, a whipping healed, but public disgrace lived on. Towns were small, gossip spread quickly, and reputations were fragile. A woman once paraded through the streets carried the stain for life. Even if she tried to leave the trade, memories of the humiliation clung to her, closing doors to marriage, work, or community acceptance. At times, these rituals spiraled into violence. Crowds, encouraged by the spectacle, sometimes took matters into their own hands, throwing stones, garbage, or filth at the women. Officials often turned a blind eye, allowing the mob to amplify the punishment. The line between sanctioned ritual and uncontrolled cruelty was thin, and prostitutes bore the consequences. The paradox is striking. Medieval society tolerated prostitution, profited from it, and relied on it as a necessary evil. Yet it continually reminded prostitutes of their despised status through these humiliations. The spectacles allowed communities to vent their anxieties, to perform purity in public, while privately maintaining the system that made such performances necessary. In the end, public humiliation was not just a punishment, it was a performance of power. It declared that prostitutes could exist, but only as long as they remained marked, visible, and degraded. Their suffering was transformed into moral theater, a communal ritual that reinforced order at their expense. The crowd went home satisfied, reassured of its virtue, while the women returned to their quarters branded, once again, as outsiders. Beyond daily regulations and humiliations, prostitution sometimes erupted into scandals so large that they shook entire communities. These moments revealed not only the fragility of tolerance, but also the deep anxieties medieval society carried about sex, honor, and disorder. When brothels or prostitutes crossed invisible boundaries, or when the hypocrisy of clients became too visible, scandal followed. One common source of scandal was the involvement of clerics. Priests and monks were not supposed to frequent brothels, yet records show they often did. From Paris to Florence, chronicles mention entire groups of clerics caught in houses of prostitution. In some towns, scandals erupted when priests were accused of keeping mistresses under the guise of servants. These incidents were particularly damaging because they exposed the hypocrisy of the church. Moral outrage was swift, but reform was usually short-lived. Authorities might issue new decrees banning clerics from brothels, but enforcement was lax. The scandals faded, only to reappear again and again. Brothels themselves sometimes became the focus of public anger. Fires, murders, or outbreaks of disease linked to red light districts triggered moral panics. In Strasbourg during the 15th century, an epidemic led authorities to blame prostitutes as carriers of divine punishment. Brothels were raided, women expelled, and sermons thundered against sin. Yet within a few years the trade returned, tolerated once more. Scandals revealed how quickly acceptance could turn to violence, but also how shallow reform was when faced with unchanging demand. Noblemen, too, found themselves at the center of scandal when their indulgence became too visible. Chroniclers tell of lords who squandered fortunes in brothels, neglecting their estates and dishonoring their families. One tale from Italy describes a wealthy merchant whose nightly visits to prostitutes became so notorious that his rivals used it against him in court, accusing him of wasting family resources. While the details were often exaggerated, the gossip itself damaged reputations. For the rich, discretion was essential. When it failed, scandal followed. Violence created some of the darkest scandals. Prostitutes murdered by clients, fights breaking out in brothels, or women accused of theft during encounters all drew public attention. In many cases, the women were blamed regardless of the circumstances. A prostitute killed in a brawl might be buried without rites, her death treated as an inevitable consequence of her trade. Yet when such incidents multiplied, towns were forced to respond. Temporary closures of brothels, public trials, or moral campaigns followed, each leaving a mark on communal memory. Scandals also arose when prostitutes themselves resisted. There are records of women petitioning city councils for better treatment, refusing to wear humiliating clothing, or banding together to protest unfair taxes. Such defiance shocked communities unused to seeing these women as anything but submissive. In some cases, their resistance led to harsher crackdowns. In others, it sparked debates about the limits of control. These moments remind us that prostitutes were not passive victims, but individuals capable of challenging the system, even if the cost was great. Occasionally, scandals took on symbolic weight, becoming stories retold for generations. In German towns, tales circulated of prostitutes who attempted to marry respectable men, only to be exposed at the altar and dragged through the streets. In England, stories spread of women who seduced priests and caused parish scandals. Whether entirely true or embellished, these accounts reinforced the image of prostitutes as dangerous, disruptive figures whose presence threatened the fragile order of society. At the heart of these scandals was always the same contradiction. Prostitution was tolerated as long as it remained invisible, confined to certain spaces and rules. But the moment it spilled into public view, through disease, violence, clerical involvement, or resistance, it became intolerable. Communities reacted with anger not because prostitution was new, but because it reminded them of truths they preferred to ignore. That lust crossed every boundary, that men of all ranks participated, and that the system itself was built on exploitation. These scandals reveal that medieval prostitution was never truly stable. It balanced on the edge of acceptance and condemnation, its survival dependent on silence and denial. When that silence broke, when hypocrisy became too visible, society lashed out in fear and fury. Yet the trade always returned, stitched back into the fabric of towns, tolerated until the next scandal emerged. In the end, the great scandals of medieval prostitution were less about the women themselves and more about the discomfort of the society around them. They exposed the cracks in a system that managed sin without resolving it, and they reminded everyone that beneath the rituals of morality lay a truth no one could escape. Prostitution was woven into the very structure of medieval life. Scandalous, not because it existed, but because it revealed the hypocrisy of those who used it and condemned it in the same breath. As the Middle Ages gave way to the Renaissance, prostitution, long tolerated as a necessary evil, entered a period of transformation and, in many regions, decline. The shift was not sudden nor uniform across Europe, but the pressures of disease, moral reform, and political change gradually altered the place of prostitution in society. What had once been openly regulated within city walls became more hidden, more stigmatized, and more vigorously suppressed. One of the most decisive factors was the arrival of syphilis at the end of the 15th century. This new and terrifying disease spread rapidly, leaving disfigurement and death in its wake. Unlike earlier infections, syphilis was unmistakable, with visible sores and devastating symptoms. Communities that had long tolerated prostitution suddenly saw it as a direct threat to public health. Brothels, once managed and taxed by authorities, became associated with contagion. Panic swept across Europe, and city councils rushed to issue decrees closing public houses of women. What had been considered controllable sin now appeared as uncontrolled danger. At the same time, the moral climate was shifting. The Renaissance is often remembered as an age of art and humanism, but it also saw waves of religious reform that targeted vice with new intensity. In Italy, preachers like Savonarola thundered against immorality, calling for the destruction of brothels and the expulsion of prostitutes. In Northern Europe, the Protestant Reformation further sharpened hostility toward prostitution. Reformers who rejected many Catholic practices also condemned the toleration of brothels, seeing them as symbols of corruption and moral decay. What Augustine and Aquinas had once defended as a necessary evil was increasingly denounced as an intolerable stain. Civic authorities followed this new spirit. Cities that had once proudly listed brothel taxes in their budgets began to conceal or abandon them. In some towns, brothel buildings were repurposed into hospitals, schools, or almshouses, as if to erase the memory of their former use. Others drove prostitutes into exile, forbidding them from residing within city walls. The spectacle of public tolerance gave way to harsher forms of repression. Prostitutes, who had once lived in designated districts, were now chased into shadows, forced to operate in secrecy at greater personal risk. The decline was also tied to changing ideas about honor and family. In the Middle Ages, prostitution had been justified as a safeguard for honest women, protecting wives and daughters from seduction. But as Renaissance ideals of marriage, lineage, and household honor grew sharper, prostitution came to be seen less as a safety valve and more as a threat. Husbands and fathers feared the spread of disease, not only to themselves, but to their legitimate heirs. What had once been tolerated for the sake of order was now rejected for the sake of purity. Ironically, this decline did not mean prostitution disappeared. It simply moved underground. Illegal prostitution flourished in taverns, inns, and private houses. Street walking became more common, even as punishments grew harsher. Women who had once lived within regulated systems now faced the double danger of secrecy and criminality. They were no longer necessary evils, but outlaws, chased by police and despised by society. The transition also revealed regional differences. In some Italian cities, prostitution remained partially visible, protected by powerful patrons who shielded mistresses and courtesans. In France, royal mistresses became figures of influence. Their position paradoxically celebrated even as common prostitutes were condemned. In Protestant regions, brothels were more aggressively shut down, reflecting the stricter moral climate. The decline was uneven, but the overall trend was clear. Tolerance gave way to repression. For the women themselves, the shift was devastating. In the medieval world, their existence was precarious but at least acknowledged. They were taxed, regulated, and stigmatized, but they had a recognized, if marginal, place in society. With the Renaissance, that space shrank. Prostitutes were driven out, silenced, or hidden, their lives even more fragile. The hypocrisy remained, but it became more secretive, cloaked beneath the surface of a society that claimed to be more refined. In the end, the decline of medieval prostitution was less about morality than about fear. Fear of disease, fear of scandal, fear of disruption in an age obsessed with order and lineage. The brothels that once stood openly at city gates fell silent, their walls converted or abandoned. But prostitution itself endured, transformed into something less visible, less tolerated, and more dangerous. The shift from medieval tolerance to Renaissance repression marked not the end of prostitution, but the end of its uneasy acceptance as part of the visible fabric of daily life. As centuries passed, the memory of medieval prostitution began to change. What had once been a daily reality of poverty, regulation, and humiliation was gradually recast in softer, sometimes glamorous tones. Writers, artists, and later historians often painted a picture far removed from the harshness lived by the women themselves. The romanticized image of the medieval prostitute emerged, layered with fantasy, while the brutal truth faded into shadows. The most striking transformation appeared in literature. Medieval romances and early modern plays occasionally portrayed prostitutes, or women of questionable virtue, as witty, alluring figures. They were given sharp tongues, quick humor, and the power to entrap foolish men. In some stories, they were temptresses draped in velvet, courted by nobles, their lives infused with intrigue. Such portrayals bore little resemblance to the reality of cramped brothels and relentless regulations. Yet, they appealed to audiences who preferred entertainment to grim truth. Art also contributed to this shift. Painters depicted courtesans reclining in luxurious chambers, their robes rich, their surroundings opulent. These images blurred the line between prostitute and mistress, between the reality of poverty and the fantasy of sensual power. The women shown in these works seemed to control their destinies, offering desire on their own terms. Few viewers considered the vast gulf between such depictions and the lives of ordinary prostitutes forced into servitude by debt or hunger. By the Renaissance, the figure of the courtesan occupied a peculiar space in European imagination. High-class courtesans in cities like Venice or Rome were celebrated for their beauty, wit, and even cultural influence. They hosted salons, entertained scholars, and sometimes shaped politics from behind the scenes. Chroniclers wrote of them with admiration, blurring their stories into legend. Meanwhile, the vast majority of prostitutes, poor, sick, and despised, remained invisible, their reality drowned out by the dazzling myth of courtesan glamour. This romanticized image endured for centuries. Later writers in the 18th and 19th centuries looked back at the Middle Ages and imagined prostitution as colorful, even liberating. Brothels became settings for bawdy comedy. Prostitutes became stock characters in plays and novels, objects of humor rather than pity. The historical truth that these women were heavily regulated, humiliated, and often destroyed by the trade was largely forgotten. The persistence of this fantasy reveals more about society's desires than about history itself. To imagine prostitutes as witty courtesans or powerful seductresses was to avoid confronting the suffering of real women. It allowed men to indulge fascination without guilt, to consume stories of lust without facing the cruelty that sustained them. The romanticized image turned exploitation into entertainment, erasing the voices of those who had endured the trade. Historians have worked to dismantle these myths. Documents from medieval courts, tax rolls, and ordinances tell a very different story. They reveal women fined for leaving their districts, whipped for refusing to wear distinctive clothing, and expelled when illness struck. They show lives cut short by disease, poverty, and violence. They strip away the velvet curtain to reveal the straw bedding, the stench of taverns, the jeers of crowds. The contrast between romanticized image and historical reality could not be starker. Yet the myth persists. Popular culture still draws on the image of the medieval prostitute as a figure of allure, danger, and freedom. Films, novels, and even video games often echo the fantasy of the courtesan, with little attention to the suffering beneath. This persistence reflects an old pattern. Society is more comfortable with stories of desire than with stories of degradation. The truth, however, is sobering. The medieval prostitute was not a glamorous seductress, but a woman trapped in a system that tolerated her only as long as she remained degraded. Her life was marked by poverty, regulation, humiliation, and early death. The romanticized image erases that reality, turning suffering into spectacle. To recover the truth is not only to correct history, but to give voice, at last, to the women silenced by centuries of myth. One of the most decisive factors was the arrival of syphilis at the end of the 15th century. This new and terrifying disease spread rapidly, leaving disfigurement and death in its wake. Unlike earlier infections, syphilis was unmistakable, with visible sores and devastating symptoms. Communities that had long tolerated prostitution suddenly saw it as a direct threat to public health. Brothels, once managed and taxed by authorities, became associated with contagion. Panic swept across Europe, and city councils rushed to issue decrees closing public houses of women. What had been considered controllable sin now appeared as uncontrolled danger. At the same time, the moral climate was shifting. The Renaissance is often remembered as an age of art and humanism, but it also saw waves of religious reform that targeted vice with new intensity. In Italy, preachers like Savonarola thundered against immorality, calling for the destruction of brothels and the expulsion of prostitutes. In Northern Europe, the Protestant Reformation further sharpened hostility toward prostitution. Reformers who rejected many Catholic practices also condemned the toleration of brothels, seeing them as symbols of corruption and moral decay. What Augustine and Aquinas had once defended as a necessary evil was increasingly denounced as an intolerable stain. Civic authorities followed this new spirit. Cities that had once proudly listed brothel taxes in their budgets began to conceal or abandon them. In some towns, brothel buildings were repurposed into hospitals, schools, or almshouses, as if to erase the memory of their former use. Others drove prostitutes into exile, forbidding them from residing within city walls. The spectacle of public tolerance gave way to harsher forms of repression. Prostitutes, who had once lived in designated districts, were now chased into shadows, forced to operate in secrecy at greater personal risk. The decline was also tied to changing ideas about honor and family. In the Middle Ages, prostitution had been justified as a safeguard for honest women, protecting wives and daughters from seduction. But as Renaissance ideals of marriage, lineage, and household honor grew sharper, prostitution came to be seen less as a safety valve and more as a threat. Husbands and fathers feared the spread of disease, not only to themselves but to their legitimate heirs. What had once been tolerated for the sake of order was now rejected for the sake of purity. Ironically, this decline did not mean prostitution disappeared. It simply moved underground. Illegal prostitution flourished in taverns, inns, and private houses. Streetwalking became more common, even as punishments grew harsher. Women who had once lived within regulated systems now faced the double danger of secrecy and criminality. They were no longer necessary evils, but outlaws, chased by police and despised by society. The transition also revealed regional differences. In some Italian cities, prostitution remained partially visible, protected by powerful patrons who shielded mistresses and courtesans. In France, royal mistresses became figures of influence, their position paradoxically celebrated even as common prostitutes were condemned. In Protestant regions, brothels were more aggressively shut down, reflecting the stricter moral climate. The decline was uneven, but the overall trend was clear. Tolerance gave way to repression. For the women themselves, the shift was devastating. In the medieval world, their existence was precarious but at least acknowledged. They were taxed, regulated, and stigmatized, but they had a recognized, if marginal, place in society. With the Renaissance, that space shrank. Prostitutes were driven out, silenced, or hidden, their lives even more fragile. The hypocrisy remained, but it became more secretive, cloaked beneath the surface of a society that claimed to be more refined. In the end, the decline of medieval prostitution was less about morality than about fear. Fear of disease, fear of scandal, fear of disruption in an age obsessed with order and lineage. The brothels that once stood openly at city gates fell silent, their walls converted or abandoned. But prostitution itself endured, transformed into something less visible, less tolerated, and more dangerous. The shift from medieval tolerance to Renaissance repression marked not the end of prostitution, but the end of its uneasy acceptance as part of the visible fabric of daily life. As centuries passed, the memory of medieval prostitution began to change. What had once been a daily reality of poverty, regulation, and humiliation was gradually recast in softer, sometimes glamorous tones. Writers, artists, and later historians often painted a picture far removed from the harshness lived by the women themselves. The romanticized image of the medieval prostitute emerged, layered with fantasy, while the brutal truth faded into shadows. The most striking transformation appeared in literature. Medieval romances and early modern plays occasionally portrayed prostitutes, or women of questionable virtue, as witty, alluring figures. They were given sharp tongues, quick humor, and the power to entrap foolish men. In some stories, they were temptresses draped in velvet, courted by nobles, their lives infused with intrigue. Such portrayals bore little resemblance to the reality of cramped brothels and relentless regulations, yet they appealed to audiences who preferred entertainment to grim truth. Art also contributed to this shift. Painters depicted courtesans reclining in luxurious chambers, their robes rich, their surroundings opulent. These images blurred the line between prostitute and mistress, between the reality of poverty and the fantasy of sensual power. The women shown in these works seemed to control their destinies, offering desire on their own terms. Few viewers considered the vast gulf between such depictions and the lives of ordinary prostitutes forced into servitude by debt or hunger. By the Renaissance, the figure of the courtesan occupied a peculiar space in European imagination. High-class courtesans in cities like Venice or Rome were celebrated for their beauty, wit, and even cultural influence. They hosted salons, entertained scholars, and sometimes shaped politics from behind the scenes. Chroniclers wrote of them with admiration, blurring their stories into legend. Meanwhile, the vast majority of prostitutes, poor, sick, and despised, remained invisible, their reality drowned out by the dazzling myth of courtesan glamour. This romanticized image endured for centuries. Later writers in the 18th and 19th centuries looked back at the Middle Ages and imagined prostitution as colorful, even liberating. Brothels became settings for bawdy comedy. Prostitutes became stock characters in plays and novels, objects of humor rather than pity. The historical truth that these women were heavily regulated, humiliated, and often destroyed by the trade was largely forgotten. The persistence of this fantasy reveals more about society's desires than about history itself. To imagine prostitutes as witty courtesans or powerful seductresses was to avoid confronting the suffering of real women. It allowed men to indulge fascination without guilt, to consume stories of lust without facing the cruelty that sustained them. The romanticized image turned exploitation into entertainment, erasing the voices of those who had endured the trade. Historians have worked to dismantle these myths. Documents from medieval courts, tax rolls, and ordinances tell a very different story. They reveal women fined for leaving their districts, whipped for refusing to wear distinctive clothing, and expelled when illness struck. They show lives cut short by disease, poverty, and violence. They strip away the velvet curtain to reveal the straw bedding, the stench of taverns, the jeers of crowds. The contrast between romanticized image and historical reality could not be starker. Yet the myth persists. Popular culture still draws on the image of the medieval prostitute as a figure of allure, danger, and freedom. Films, novels, and even video games often echo the fantasy of the courtesan, with little attention to the suffering beneath. This persistence reflects an old pattern. Society is more comfortable with stories of desire than with stories of degradation. The truth, however, is sobering. The medieval prostitute was not a glamorous seductress, but a woman trapped in a system that tolerated her only as long as she remained degraded. Her life was marked by poverty, regulation, humiliation, and early death. The romanticized image erases that reality, turning suffering into spectacle. To recover the truth is not only to correct history, but to give voice at last to the women silenced by centuries of myth.